This is the LatinNews Podcast, and I am Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. We're very privileged to have Dr. Julio Carrión on the show this week. We're going to be discussing, current events in Peru. Dr. Julio Carrión specializes in Latin American and comparative politics at the University of Delaware, and we're speaking with him on the line from New Jersey at the moment. Dr. Julio, welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, although I feel that this might be not only the perfect time for a conversation about Peru, but the most imperfect time because things happen so fast. And we're looking at, again, instability and political uncertainty in Peru, which seems to be the nature of the game. 8 presidents since 2018. We're currently with a kind of, I'd say, in a holding pattern with the president Jose Maria Balcazar, with the first round of elections to take place on April the 12th. Perhaps we can start with the very basics. Is how did we get here?
Yeah, how do we get here? So I would say there are medium-term reasons and short-term reasons, right? So the medium-term reasons, I will start the story in the year 2000, which is the year when Alberto Fujimori was removed from office, even though he technically resigned the presidency via fax when he was in Japan. So that's just to set up a president resigning by fax. And that was the moment when Peru transitioned to electoral democracy in a context that was quite difficult because of the 10 years of Fujimori rule have really undermined Peruvian party system. So there were no strong parties at the moment that Peru transition to democracy. And I think that is a significant reason why we're having what we're having. But the point is that Peru had such an extraordinary economic growth from 2001 up to, let's say, 2013, 2014, that a lot of the institutional failures or more the institutional problems were not quite apparent in that context of such a dramatic growth. But then we reached the elections in 2016, and that's where I will say that's the beginning of the short-term problems, which was a election in which Keiko Fujimori ran for the presidency for the second time. She lost by 45,000 votes in the runoff out of 16 million votes. It was by a whisker, but her party gained a significant control of Congress, if I remember, close to 75, 76 out of the 130 National Assembly. And she really was hurt by the electoral defeat. And she decided that, as she said publicly, she was going to rule Peru from Congress. And that's when significant red lines were beginning to be crossed in Peru. In 2018, we have the impeachment of President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski by the flimsiest of the excuses. There were some investigations regarding corruption that could have easily been investigated and even sanctioned after he finished his term. But since the Fujimoristas and other parties had majority in Congress, they just removed him. And I think that was a significant red line. It was the first time that a president had been impeached using that article in the Constitution that says that a president that lacks moral capacity can be removed. So that was one. Then we have a vice president that took over, Martin Vizcarra, who understood that he needed to really campaign against Congress, against the Fujimorista Congress. So Peru entered into a process of political polarization. Martin Vizcarra used his popularity to introduce a number of significant constitutional reforms, including a banning on the re-election of members of Congress, which I think was a major mistake because it reduced the time horizon of Congress people. And then, of course, he also crossed another red line, which was to shut down Congress constitutionally, I might say, because Congress refused a motion of confidence for the second time. He decided that he was going to shut down Congress and call for new congressional elections. So Peru really entered into a situation of power politics, really hardball politics. The president is missing Congress, Congress is missing the president, and here we are. Since then, we had 8 different presidents. Basically, Peru, for peculiar circumstances, had almost turned into a parliamentary regime in which presidents can last for as long as they hold the confidence of Congress. But I think the root of the problem is the lack of programmatic political parties, the fact that most members in Congress have been elected by personalistic vehicles, parties that really respond to private economic interests. Some members of Congress got financing, illegally financing from informal economies, even economies that were borderline criminal. And so it is just a collection of private interests that has turned in the last 4 to 5 years into a predatory organization. Really, Congress has dismantled rule of law in Peru in very dramatic ways. And so here we are. We have no idea what is going to happen in the runoff, in the electoral, in the first round in April. Will Keiko Fujimori make it to the second round for the 4th time? Who knows? The polls, the most recent polls, are showing a little bit of a movement there. Lopez Chao, another university president who wants to become president of the country, is having some kind of momentum. But as I said, 30 days, it's an eternity in Peruvian politics. So we won't know. In the last election in 2021, poll conducted by the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos showed that almost 40% of people decided their vote on the last week before the election. We still have a few weeks to go.
And in Peru, it's mandatory to vote, isn't it? Everyone dips their finger in the ink.
And you have to, if you don't vote, you pay a fine. Yeah, it's compulsory.
That we went all the way back to the year 2000 and looking at Fujimori. It's incredible to think in 2026, we're still looking back at the legacy of Alberto Fujimori. And of course, I'm thinking about when you talk about the illicit or the illegal groups and the private interests, you can't say Fujimori without mentioning Vladimiro Montesinos, of course, and the videos. And it seemed to just engender a type of corruption within Peruvian politics. And so to me, Peruvians are like, yeah, we know that they're all awful. We know that they're all out for their own individual gain. So with a name like Fujimori, how do we justify the continual popularity of Keiko Fujimori?
Yeah. Declining though, right? I hear my memory might fail me, but in the 2016 election, Keiko made it to the runoff. I think she had about probably 30% of the vote, if not a little bit more. I'm trying to remember. But in 2021, when she made it to the second round, she had about 15% of the vote. So there was half of what she got. And the only reason why she made it to the runoff was because the political fragmentation was such that she ended up being second. Pedro Castillo, who finally won the presidency, he made it to the runoff with 19% of the vote. If you count 19 plus 14, it's less than 40%, right? So 60% of voters voted for candidates that did not make it to the runoff. And so they were forced to choose between Pedro Castillo and Keiko Fujimori. Keiko Fujimori lost again by a whisker, like 42,000 votes in a votes contest. And I think that she has a core, right? She has a core of supporters that is increasingly smaller, but is large enough to give her a viable path to make it to the second round, to the runoff, where almost invariably she will lose, right? Because the coalition against her and the Fujimori legacy is still larger in Peru. I have my doubts that she might actually make it to the runoff this time, but it's too early to tell, right? I think that she might be actually overcome by some of those who are now positioned to get closer to the top positions. But as I said, too early to tell.
It's a bold statement with only 30 days to go in Peru.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the candidates. We've mentioned Keiko Fujimori, and then we've got Rafael López Aliaga, and we have Alfonso López Chao, who you mentioned, the Ahora Nación. It's the left wing. He's an economist.
It's a center. It's a center left, more to the center than to the left. But of course, in the Peruvian context, they want to make him a candidate of the left. I wouldn't describe him as a leftist. Certainly, the left-wing parties in Peru do not recognize him as a lefty. There are two openly left-wing parties, one of them a Marxist party who is running, Vladimiro Cerrón. The current president happened to be a congressman who was elected in the ticket of this Marxist-Leninist party, and now he's the president of Peru. Ideology doesn't really matter, and Peru Libre, who was the party of Pedro Castillo, really is another one of these collections of private interests, personalistic vehicles rather than ideological ones. But yeah, those are I will say, the three main contenders. There is a fourth one who has been rising in the polls, Wolfgang Grosso, a retired Major General from the Air Force. I think he's attracting a lot of Limeño votes, but he is a center-right candidate, right? So he is growing by gaining votes from López Aliaga and perhaps Keiko Fujimori. And so I wouldn't be surprised. We have to see the next round of polls, but I will say that either López Chao or Grosso might be one of those two candidates that have a very sudden growth in the last 2 weeks of the election. And they are so different, right? López Chao was a university president for a number of years. He became known because during the protests against Dina Boluarte, who replaced Pedro Castillo, López Aliaga, who was mayor of Lima at the time, closed the public plaza so protesters that were coming from the provinces could not stay there overnight. Because there were many people coming from the provinces to Lima, and they didn't have a place to stay, and they usually stay in plazas like Plaza San Martin, and López Aliaga at the time decided that nobody will be allowed to stay there overnight. So López Chao, as president of the University of Engineering, opened the doors to those who were coming from the provinces, and he gave them housing there. And so I think that cemented his attraction, especially in the Andean and southern parts of Peru. And that is the political capital that he has, because he was perceived as somebody who was fighting against this confluence of conservative forces in Congress. And that is his main political capital. He is not one of them when there is a lot of discontent against them, those who were in control of Congress. And so since López Chao is not part of that confluence of interest of that informal alliance, he's perceived as somebody who can represent movement for change. He grew in the polls a little. He seems to be stuck. But again, as the election day approaches, a lot of people who might be looking at other candidates might decide that López Chao is the person to vote for. We won't know really. We won't know until 2 weeks from now, when we have the closest polls to the election day. Yeah.
What seems so interesting to me is that what you talk about, the people, the almost paternalistic figure, or he doesn't represent the normal political class. Well, we've had that with Jose Herri, we've had that with Ollanta Humala, we've had that with Alejandro Toledo, we had that with, I'm trying to think of Pedro Castillo.
That's right.
I'm just going through them all in my head. And there's been the sort of bookends of Alan Garcia, who did represent that, and others. But it just seems very cyclical, and that this is, we'll need to vote someone in who doesn't represent the powerful political elites, and yet then they become a target straight away once they're in power. When you've got someone like Keiko Fujimori who controls so much of Congress, then nothing can get done. It just seems that we are in the same situation again and again.
Yeah. And the sad part of the story is that the person who is elected as representing change, once he comes to power, is more of the same, right? Perhaps in a different scale, but the lesson of Pedro Castillo was really depressing, because here you have somebody who represented these desires for institutional change and perhaps social inclusion. He is a rural, he's now in prison, but he is a rural teacher, and he was wearing this hat who was quite symbolic. And then he came to the presidency, and then once in the presidency, it just became a mechanism for low-scale corruption. It wasn't even Fujimori level corruption, right? We're not talking millions of dollars, we're talking thousands of dollars, but corruption nonetheless. And the apportion or the distribution of ministries because of political alliances, and each minister became somebody who used his or her position also to extract resources for the little parties that were part of the congressional representation. And at the end, Castillo had a strange coalition of his parties, left-wing parties, and center parties, and eventually he decided that he was going to shut down Congress because he thought he was going to be impeached. And then here we are, right? Because he certainly didn't have the votes nor the support of the armed forces. So it was like, it came out of the blue. And it is obvious that there was significant corruption in the Pedro Castillo government. So once again, you have the hopes put into this person, and then once in power, he abandons any efforts to actually govern and engages in this petty corruption that was quite corrosive, right? In alliance with some of the parties that ended up actually being part of this informal confluence of forces. I don't want to use the term coalition, because really it's not that these parties have decided to pursue some kind of agenda in Congress. It's just a confluence of different interests. And sometimes when the interests are the same, which is to basically steal blindly from the state, they come together and they have the votes. The main opposition to Pedro Castillo from the conservative parties was that he wanted to change Peru's constitution via a constituent assembly. But once Castillo was deposed and Dina Boluarte became president, Peru's constitution has been changing almost 40% of it. We have changed the architecture of the political power. So now we're going to have a Senate, which actually people voted against in a popular plebiscite in 2019. So that was discarded by Congress. So Congress passed a constitutional provision to do that. So many of the things that people say they are not going to do, they ended up doing once they reach power. So that fosters this sense of skepticism, anger, and also rejection of the political class. However, somehow, because of the significant political fragmentation, these parties keep being elected. There are 35 presidential candidates in this round. And the only reason why we have 35 is because one just died 2 days ago in an accident. It's a tragic accident, but he passed away.
Car accident.
Yeah, it was a car accident. It's terrible. But it's like, how can people choose between 35 candidates? So, yeah, the best known political symbols and names are likely to be represented again in Congress, unless something happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks where people decided, okay, I'm fed up, I'm going to vote for either Lopez Chao or somebody else who has nothing to do with this set of forces in Congress, and give them enough congressional support to prevent any process of impeachment in the near future. We shall see.
We shall see, because as we said, things move so fast, and we've got President Jose Maria Balcazar, and I mean, we're recording this on the 18th of March, and even in the period when I've been preparing for this, we know that the Prime Minister, Denise Miralles, resigned, and that when the Prime Minister resigned, there has to be most of the cabinet resign, but he's doing a reshuffle. What is the point of all this with just 30 days remaining? It just seems to create more instability.
Oh, yeah. One of the newspapers in Peru today, the cover was Peru is in ruins, or the government is in ruins. And that literally, right, is the case. Casar was elected interim president because the majority of Congress thought that he was somebody that they could control. And what is happening since then is that, in fact, yeah, he really is a puppet of the forces of Congress, right? He went for one prime minister initially, Hernando de Soto, a well-known economist. Somehow that didn't pan out because some parties apparently opposed that. And Hernando de Soto also said, if you want me to be prime minister, then I want to be the one appointing the ministers, as the Constitution says. The president appoints the prime minister, then the prime minister appoints ministers. And of course, Balcázar didn't want that, so he disregarded Hernando de Soto. And then he went for Mirelles, and she was supposed to ask for a vote of confidence today. That was the day that she was supposed to go to Congress and request that vote of confidence. So she resigned yesterday. There is a new prime minister, Luis Arroyo, I believe. And so now he has a 30-day deadline to go to Congress and request a vote of confidence. Most likely, he will go to Congress after the first round of elections. So he has until April 18 to go and request a vote of confidence. Most likely, he will get it. But it also means that for 2 months, more or less, Peru will have a government that has not been sanctioned by Congress, which is really, in the greater scheme of things, not surprising, since we consider that it took about 2 days to Congress to elect a new president to replace Heri. Peru was literally without a president for 48 hours, or maybe even a little bit more. And life just went about, nothing has happened. It's really surprising how people feel that their daily lives are so completely detached from political processes. And there is a little conversation among experts and observers of Peruvian politics, like wondering how is it possible that the economy seems to be doing all right in the midst of this dramatic political instability. And that's a conversation to have. My view is that Peru's economy could have performed even much better than it's doing now if we have political stability. The fact that it's doing as well as it is, it's a indication of the solidity of the fundamentals, but also the fact that Peru is mostly an export economy, and demands from the global market is still strong enough to fuel that economic growth. But Peru could have do much better if there were political stability and we have a much better Minister of Finance, right?
I bring that into context. I saw a figure that the year-on-year growth has been more than 3.5%. Very, in a time of great polarization and uncertainty globally, and especially in the global South. And I'm loath to use the term of the Peruvian paradox.
We've all used it.
We've all used it. But it's like where I'm located in Colombia, if we could have our version of the Peruvian paradox, we'd be very happy. But the government sneezes and the US says something and we are immediately affected, and the economy is affected. But Peru still, with its gold, its copper, and other precious metals, and of course, we have to bring in the relationship with China. We have to bring in these are huge deals. Right. And I'd suggest to you, and I'm sure you'll tell me otherwise if I'm out of place, but the mega port in Chancay and others, and the electric car plant now near to Arequipa, these, regardless of whoever is in power, all of this is going ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And the role of Chinese interests is very important in Peruvian politics. Jose Heri was seen as a person that was very close to a Chinese interest in Peru. In fact, the beginning of his demise was because he showed up to have a late dinner in a Chinese restaurant in Lima. We call them chifas, a Chinese restaurant, around 11 o'clock at night on December 28th, I remember. wearing a hoodie, covering his face so that he wouldn't be identified. With, of course, there were cameras everywhere, so somebody leaked the tape, and there you have it. Why was he going to a Chinese restaurant, hiding his face on a late night, and turned out that he was meeting some people, Chinese businessmen and representatives of Chinese interests in Peru, and there were a number of business transactions that have not been quite explained. But that was the beginning, right? That was the beginning of his demise. He was quite popular for a couple of months. The point is that China plays a very important role in Peru's economy. I will say one of the reasons why Peru's economy is doing as well as it is because of these economic ties, commercial ties with China. Peru's economy is not as dependent as, let's say, Colombia's economy on the US market, right? So if Trump decides to slap a 50% tariff on Colombian coffee, God forbid, because I drink it, that will affect significantly, right, Colombia's economy. Peru can probably withstand a significant tariff on some of his agricultural products going to United States, but Peru has a lot of business with Europe and China, and also metals, right? Minerals. So it has, at least in terms of the exports, the mineral exports, a little bit more of diversification. Copper, right? We forget how much the price of copper has increased, and that is a significant source of income. And then, of course, illegal mining, gold, right? Peru has exported, I have no idea, but it's a significant exporter of illegal gold. Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, I'm sure Colombia too. These are the sort of illegal economy that also is fueling some of this growth that sometimes doesn't really appear on the books.
Was it former President Vizcarra who was deposed? He was made to resign impeached due to issues with mining corruption in the south?
No, it was mostly because of some corruption that happened while he was governor of one of the departments.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily mining related. It was more on constructions, the construction of a hospital and stuff like that. And then stuff like his role on the vaccines, because he was one of those politicians who was first in line to get the vaccine, Chinese vaccine, I know. So it came to, but it wasn't really, I don't remember any major political figure that has been sanctioned politically because of illegal activity or relationships with illegal activities in the mining sector, which is a problem because there is a lot, right?
There's a lot, yes.
One of the problems of the Peru's political system is that there has been a ban on private financing of campaigns. So the financing of campaigns is now public. Of course, if you're an illegal miner or you have illegal interests, what does it matter if you give money to candidates, right? You're already involved in criminal activities. Giving money to a candidate is not going to mean significantly larger penalties for you. And if you're running for a candidate and you need money and the other person is not willing to reveal it and you cannot prove it, then why not take that private money that might not be available to others? And so the paradox, talking about the Peruvian paradox, the paradox of banning the use of private financing has meant that illegal money now can go into the political campaigns and cannot be registered, cannot be controlled. And parties and candidates that want to go by the rules cannot appeal to private money because that is now banned. You cannot get money from banks or other companies or private institutions because that is not allowed. So the only money available other than the state money is the one that is illegal. And that sort of fosters a congressional representation whose first duty is to defend those private and illegal activities that brought them to Congress. That's the paradox.
It is certainly a paradox that it's top down and bottom up that seems to affect Peruvian politics. I wanted to ask a question. Of course, when we talk about Peru's diversification of its markets and the export economy, the regular Peruvian is benefiting from this growth and this boom, because it's nice to know that Peru has a position from which to negotiate. Obviously, having so many natural advantages of this level, as we said, copper and zinc and gold and beyond. But this money is yes, of any benefit to, let's say, rural communities in Peru?
Yeah, not really. That is another of the problems of Peru's politics, right? That it's layered on a terrain that is highly unequal, right? Where wealth is significantly misdistributed, right? So those who benefit the most are those living in the major cities, Lima, middle class, upper middle class, perhaps those who are living in some of the largest cities in the interior, but not the rural areas. They do not really enjoy there are parts of the country where the economies are quite limited, where people go hungry, where there is a significant caloric deficiency among children. And that really is a problem that Peru's political system has not been able to address, even in a context of plenty. Yes, poverty today is less than it was 25 years ago. There has been some progress, but it could have been reduced much more if we had some programmatic political parties, not necessarily even from the left, even center parties that could have adopted policies of inclusion, social inclusion, income redistribution. The problem is that the economy is so informal. 80% of the labor force is in informal economy. So no contracts, no social security, no taxes. And so the state cannot really transfer significant resources to these areas because it's just not there. So you have a state that is not able to extract even modestly part of that significant wealth to attend the many social and economic needs that are still in the country. And when are those people who are not the recipients of this progress able to say something at election time? And so they go and they vote for whoever might promise a significant change, even to blow up the system. And so there is always this pocket of radical parties, even from the left or the right, that sort of foster these sentiments of let's just get into all of this, right?
I can see this. I can see this kind of reactionary politics and voting taking place in places like Acá, around there, more internal from Ayacucho. These Andean regions that really have always been overlooked. Yeah. And as we wind this down, Julio, I have to ask as well, is obviously you're in the United States. There's a government up there that swings its big stick. Obviously, a lot of the talk always, U.S. policy is against, how would you say, the international transportation of narcotics, cocaine, Peru being the second largest grower of coca. Is there any risk of a Trump government trying to enact any sort of military actions to try and cut that back, just as recently bombing in Ecuador and so on, and of course the boats in the Pacific and in the Caribbean? Is there any worry and concern in Peru?
What is surprising is how little attention President Trump has given to Peru, right? And it is Peru's drug trafficking is in some ways peculiar because despite the fact of being one of the largest producers of coca, it doesn't really have these cartels that you see in Mexico or that you see in Ecuador. Just like most of Peru's economy, even coca production is highly informal and is not consolidated. It really is interesting, right? There are no cartels, or at least they are so secretive that nobody can really identify. But I think there is a consensus that coca production in Peru is family-oriented, or at least groups of families that is highly decentralized, where everybody can really do it. Nobody really controls the transportation of coca from Peru to places like Colombia, where it's processed. And so it's very difficult to focus on a major set of cartels that could be good candidates for bombing. And in a sense, I think that probably goes to Peru's benefit because it's removed Trump's attention, right? Whereas you can talk about in Mexico, all the leaders of the major cartels are identified. We know who they are. In Ecuador, you also have all these mafias. I still don't understand the role of is it the Albanians? Why the Albanians have so much influence in, I guess it's related to trafficking to Europe. But the point is, like, Peru hasn't really done that yet at least. And that China has such a significant influence in Peru's economy, and you mentioned the ports of Shanghai and the one in Arequipa, and yet the Trump administration hasn't really paying much attention to it. And now that Trump is busy elsewhere, I think Peru has another year or two of tranquility, and by the time Trump is going to be out of office. Yeah,
because there's a benefit to Peru to fly below the radar on this and to continue its growth. It's an incredible, when you think of the Chinese investment and of course the desire by the US government to try and impede, and I guess the Trump extension of a Roosevelt corollary on the Monroe Doctrine, you would expect them to be interfering at some level, and especially with elections. But I guess they look at Peruvian elections and go, I mean, this is a complete circle in our conversation. We just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And what is interesting is that another country that is very close commercially to China in Latin America is Argentina. But because Milei is fanboy number one, Trump doesn't really care about Argentina's dealing with China. And so it's a beautiful game that Milei is playing. Milei ran against China. And then, of course, once he took office, of the economic damage that it could happen if he actually followed some of his campaign promises, then he had a 180-degree turn, and then a 360-degree turn, and then, 180, because 380 will be. And now Argentina keeps having business with China, but Argentina is having, to use the expression that many used to have, carnal relations with the United States, right? That was President Menem in the 90s, where Argentina had carnal relations with the United States. I think in the case of Peru, it has been such a mess. It has been so unpredictable. Presidents have been so low-key. Probably they cannot even remember who's the president in Peru today because it has changed so much. And that has played to the advantage of the country.
What an incredible situation to take a positive from this, to take a positive from this. Thank you so much for your time. It has been a great conversation about Peru's actual situation and potential for the future and putting it into context. Obviously, all of you listeners out there, please remember that you can subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast wherever you choose, whatever platform, YouTube and so on. I've been talking to Dr. Julio Carrión, who is a specialist in Latin American and comparative politics, originally as well from Peru. He works at the University of Delaware in the United States. Dr. Julio, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the conversation. Latin News is such a major source of information for myself too. So I'm happy to have here a conversation.
As flattery will get you absolutely everywhere. Thank you again. I've been Richard McCall, your host for Latin News here in Bogota, Colombia. We'll be back in a fortnight talking about more information from the region. So again, please subscribe, and thank you and goodbye.